Ahead of our April auction here at Manor Park Classics, we have some more of my kind of automotive bread and butter, because I like using classic cars a lot. I have dailied classic cars for quite a lot of my driving career, shall we say, but I think there is very little you can do better than with a classic BMW from their glory days. And before us today, we have an E34 5 Series. The third generation to be officially termed the 5 Series, or the fourth generation of BMW's mid-size family saloons. But this is not any E34, because this is instead the range topper from the initial range of normal available E34s, the 535i Sport, which means it has a big 3.5 litre M30 engine. So we will go for a drive in a little bit in this brilliant, if quite meagerly spec'd, with its alpine white, I believe bodywork, that's just off the top of my head, and its black interior. So it's not maybe the flashiest of 5 Series BMWs, but in a way, I kind of think that's the point. So first, I want to talk a little bit about the history of this car, about how BMW got to this point, and therefore why BMWs in this era looked like this and felt like this. What was going on in the heads of the people at BMW to lead them to producing such timeless, quite conservative, but really inspirational and intentful cars? We'll then have a little look around this particular car itself. Then, as I said, we will, of course, go for a drive. But I want to take us back first to 1962, only 25 or so years before the E34 was introduced, this car being built between 88 and 95, at least in saloon form. But back in 1962, BMW brought out their first range, their first mid-size saloon car range that we would recognise them for. Before that, BMW built a huge range of cars in all different types, but none of which really made any sense when compared to another. So in the 1950s, for example, you could buy a BMW 507, which Elvis Presley drove, with its brilliant styling, its really wide grille at the front. Again, very intentful car with its overhead valve V8 under the bonnet. But conversely, you could also buy an Isetta, a little bubble car, which really didn't look like a BMW at all. And of course, it wasn't designed by BMW, but BMW felt the need to produce that car, to build it under license, because they were failing financially. In 1959, they launched the 700, which was, again, not really a BMW as we'd recognise it today. Certainly, it had no kidney grills on the front. Sure, it was a 3-box saloon, but it was an economy car, and it had its engine mounted at the rear. Again, didn't look like a BMW to anyone, at least today. Yet 3 years on from the 700, owing to its brilliant success, them selling so many of them, BMW were able to really, clear the slate, start from scratch and decide how they were going to perceive themselves, what kind of cars they were going to design, and therefore build an image for themselves over the coming decades. So the car they launched in 1962 was known as the Neue Klasse, the new class BMW. You can tell, again, they're starting from afresh here. And this was, in all but name, a 5 Series. It had an engine mounted at the front, driving the rear wheels, with McPherson struts at the front and semi-trailing arms at the back. Nothing particularly different, nothing particularly unusual for 1962. Sure, having an independent rear suspension was very nice, and having an all-new overhead camshaft 4-cylinder engine was lovely as well. But over the coming years, the success of the Neue Klasse would allow it to be spun off into a more compact class and a more executive class. So in 1966, the Neue Klasse platform was cut down to produce the 02 series, the predecessor to what we know today as the 3 Series, with that same overhead cam 4-cylinder engine, semi-trailing arm rear suspension, but this time with only 2 doors. In 1968, they then expanded the format, producing what was known as the New 6. New 6 because it had under its bonnet an all-new straight 6 engine. That is what we recognise BMW as today, all about the straight 6s. And so from 1968, in that predecessor to the 7 Series, that is what we finally met. But it's these three cars that became known as the 5 Series, 3 Series and 7 Series that are the centre of BMW as we all know them as today. So the original Neue Klasse was replaced in 1972 by the E12 5 Series, the first to be officially badged as such, and that car was then replaced by the E28 5 Series in 1981. It is the E28 that our E34 here finally replaced in 1988. However, although BMW were building themselves in those 25 years, they didn't always have so much money. So that E28 5 Series, launched at the beginning of the 1980s, was only a major facelift and a major refresh of the existing E12 5 Series. And that means that this car, this E34 in 1988, was replacing a car that realistically dated back to the early 1970s. BMW were a really very conservative company with their designs, with their engineering, with the cars they were producing, because they knew that at any point, if people stopped buying them, they would be right back where they started. It is a very Germanic sense of cautiousness with producing, with developing new BMW models, and indeed the smaller 3 Series. The first to be officially known as a 3 Series, the E21, which I've driven on this channel, so go back and have a look at it if you'd like. Really lovely metallic green 320 with its straight 6 engine. But the E21 was introduced in 1975 when that car was replaced by the iconic E30 3 Series in 1982. Again, it was just a heavy refresh. It wasn't an all-new car. So at the end of the 1980s, when this was introduced, the core of BMW's range, the 3 Series and 5 Series, were really pretty old cars. But that did not dissuade anyone from buying them, because in this era, in the UK especially, the mid to late 80s, people really started to take BMW to their hearts, especially the kind of yuppies that became, such a thing in the mid to late 80s, those people who were, affluent of course, but also aspirational. They wanted to look better than they necessarily were. And so rather than buying a big Ford saloon, rather than buying a Ford Granada or a Vauxhall Senator or Vauxhall Carlton or anything like that, they instead decided that they wanted to break molds and they wanted to pull away from the old mainstream stalwarts of the executive car market and push towards something that at the time was a little bit more left of field, a little bit more niche, and buy themselves a BMW. Now, an idea of just how expensive BMWs were in this period is that if you were to buy a little 3 Series, a little E21, end of the line E21 3 Series, with relatively meagre specifications, let's be honest, and BMW were known in this era for not offering all that much equipment, you would have to pay for that car more than the price of a fully loaded Rover Van den Plas with its big 3.5 litre V8 and all its equipment and all its electric everything and its all that kind of stuff, cruise control even. And so BMWs were very expensive cars. So we have conservative, cautious, expensive. So BMW were not producing cars that were flashy. BMW were instead producing cars that were very well engineered with what they had. They did not go overboard with the engineering, but they did that engineering incredibly well, producing very reliable, very reliable cars that had a great image, that had a sporting image as well, as they'd won touring car championships in the intervening years. And that, in many ways, is why people started to buy BMWs, because they had this great image, they had this great reliability, and they had this great sense of Germanic quality. Now, you could say that today that's eroded, or you can even say that it was a myth in the first place. But there is no doubting that in this era, when the E34 was launched towards the end of the 80s, people saw a BMW badge on the front of the car. They saw the kidney grills on the front as well, and they thought that was something special. But the next logical question we then come to is, why did people think that this kind of car was special. At the end of the day, we've said that having an overhead camshaft was nice in 1962 and having semi-trailing arms was also very nice in 1962, but by the 80s it was not at all unusual. In fact, it was really expected to have a decent independent rear suspension. The Ford Sierra had a very similar rear suspension to these BMWs, and everyone by this point, at least in decent family saloon cars, had overhead camshaft engines. So over this time, BMW had gone from producing something that was mechanically very decent to something that was mechanically very average. Yet, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was the manner in which they were engineered that endeared people to them. But first, I want to talk about the styling, because for most consumers, they're not bothered about suspension or engines. As long as a car enthusiast says they're great, they gradually start to become acceptable to the wider public. The wider public wants style. And so in this kind of era, from the late 70s all the way through to the early 1990s, BMW's design was headed up by a chap named Klaus Luther. He led the projects of kind of all of the iconic BMWs from this era. And I believe that the E34, then the E36 3 Series were the last cars that he worked on. He later ended up in an advisory capacity at BMW all the way through until his death. But he said something very clear about BMW. So he came to the company after they'd already created this image for themselves in the 1960s. He was taking over from the likes of Wilhelm Hofmeister, for which the famous kink is named at the back, and also Paul Bracq, who did the original 3 Series. Klaus Luther came to BMW and saw what was there and decided, even when they were still growing, they were not that established yet, and said that a BMW should always look like a BMW. That it should not sway with fashion trends of its day. It should instead be its own thing, very clearly and distinctly a BMW, and not try to pander to anyone else. And that is a really, really interesting thing to think about in the context of how we know BMW today and how they've acted in the last 20, 25 years, for example. But that makes a lot of sense when we look at cars like this to think of just how conservative it was. In the 1980s, we were all getting used to jelly mold Ford Sierras, a car I mentioned only a moment ago. We were getting used to these new aerodynamic shapes, to integrated big, long lamp clusters at the front of cars and very sleek front ends. But the E34 didn't do that. Instead, the E34 has the classic 4 BMW headlamps, and it has the small, narrow kidney grills in the middle. In fact, this was the last BMW to have these features, and it introduced a new feature for BMWs that would carry throughout the next number of decades, the L-shaped lamps at the back. But it didn't break any new ground compared to the E28 that preceded it, all in spite of the fact that the E28 was a very old car. But that didn't matter to consumers, because consumers perceived these cars. They gazed upon these cars and thought, that's really classy, or it has a lot of intent to it. They are very cool, very individually styled cars that, as Klaus Luther said, they did not sway with the trends. They did not join in with automotive fads. And so, looking back at this car now, from 37 years on from its launch, and I believe this one is an H registration. So yeah, 1990, 1991, one of the two, this car. I think it might be a 91 car. But nearly 35 years on from this car's production, and it's really quite timeless. Now sure, it is 35 years old, of course, there are ways we can tell this. The huge profile on the tyres, for example, maybe the bluntness of the front end and the individual headlamps aren't quite so modern anymore. But this car has aged remarkably well. Far better, in fact, than Mercedes-Benz of this era or Audis of this era, both of which are timeless in a way in their own right, but they look very much more planted in their own decades. That idea of timelessness was central to BMW's own perception, its own image of itself. And I think that looking at these classics now, that is a brilliant thing, something that BMW should absolutely be proud of in looking at their own heritage. Yet in producing such a conservatively styled car, they also produced a very conservatively engineered car, because the E34 could be said to be the last of the truly classic BMWs, because I mentioned it about a million times already in this video, but McPherson struts, semi-trailing arms, rear-wheel drive, of course, and this was the last new BMW to be introduced with this mechanical layout. From 1990, when the E36 3 Series was launched, they switched to the new Z-axle rear end, which was undoubtedly much better controlled, a proper multi-link rear suspension, and made these cars a little bit, you know, less potentially tail happy, shall we say. But in the process, they took away a little bit of what made BMW special. So under the skin, this car has very similar suspension to everything. Every single BMW that came before from the early 1960s, which means it shares pedigree with the likes of the 3-litre CSL, which won all those European Touring Car Championships and Le Mans 24 Hours in the 1970s. It also means that in the way it drives, it's that little bit more nimble, that little bit more eager. You can feel what's going on that little bit more beneath you, as long as you keep your wits about you, of course. As long as you keep your wits about you and you know the limitations of this car's suspension setup, you can extract something really, really special about it. BMW did not create the term the ultimate driving machine for nothing. In fact, that tagline came about for the new 6 that I mentioned earlier. Again, very similar mechanical layout. So in the original meaning of that tagline, this is the ultimate driving machine. As pure as it can possibly get, and as late as it can possibly get as well, just before they stopped doing it. So for some people, you could say that not only was this at the crux of BMW's, or maybe the apex would be a better word, the apex of BMW's popularity, as they were just starting to become mainstream but were still really special. They now had a little bit of money to produce a car that was really well refined and was all new for the first time in 15 years, but it still stuck to the traditions of BMW. It still had that classic layout. So I promise we will start to go for a drive in a little bit, but to this particular E34, and as I said, this is a top of the range 535i Sport, the top of the early E34 range. And I'm just going to open this bonnet here, and you can stay there for a moment, because again, this is at the end of BMW doing things as they used to, which means you get the very, very cool forward hinging bonnet. So come over here, folks, come and have a look at the engine. So under the fantastically cool forward hinging bonnet, we of course have a 3.5 litre straight 6. There is a little bit of plastic involved, and you can't quite see the wonderful BMW lettering atop the canted over cam cover. I can see even it says 3.5 litres on the inlet manifold. Just little touches like that make you feel so much better about it. But of course, I need to be in the frame because I'm gorgeous. Look at me. But this M30 straight 6 is something very, very special, because, as I said, BMW were quite conservative. BMW didn't necessarily have the money to throw about. Instead, they built things right first time, and they did not feel the need to then muck about with them for many, many years. And so in this early range of 5 Series, or early range of E34, should I say, the 520i and the 525i were versions of the M20 straight 6. BMW's Little 6, as they called it, which was engineered for the first 3 Series, the E21 in 1977. And indeed, this was the last car again to receive that power unit. It was also the last to receive this power unit, which is the M30 straight 6, first introduced all the way back in 1968 in the new 6. And so by this point, a very long-lived, very well-proven and very reliable engine. Again, it has an overhead camshaft, and frankly, the power figures aren't all that important. What does matter, however, is that from 1991, I think the same year as this car was built, they switched to a whole new range of 6 and 8 cylinder engines. So the little 520 and 525i were replaced by the M50, which had dual overhead camshafts, an all-new design which again was a brilliant engine used in cars like the E39 5 Series, E38 7 Series and E46 3 Series, even got used in the E60 5 Series as well, including the X5 and X3. Again, that lasted for quite a long time. But the larger engines were replaced with the M60 V8. Now personally, I prefer a straight six. I prefer the smoothness and the sonority, but especially if you're from the United States, then maybe the 8-cylinder engine would do that bit better in the 530i and all new 540i. But this being the last of the M30 engines, it again gives us a little bit more pedigree. Because having been around for so long and used in the new 6, this again is essentially the same engine as was used in the 3-litre CSL. And yet here it sits in this relatively modern looking, very, very timeless, certainly very dailyable classic family saloon car. So with that out of the way, I think we're going to have to go for a drive. First things first, however, this is a 5 Series, and so it feels like a really refined luxury saloon car with that little bit of sporting character in it, absolutely. So in the best of the classic BMW traditions, we have this quite thick rim but quite small 3-spoke steering wheel in front of us, again this being a sport model. Sure, this particular car has an automatic gearbox, but you can feel the chassis below you, that it's very nimble for such a large car. Relatively, this thing seems to have a lot of character to its handling, to its suspension, etc. The power steering is overly light, I must be honest, which is a bit of a downside, but that's the same with an E30 3 Series, for example. It's nothing unusual, and of course you really need the power steering in a car of this size. But that M30 engine, which has been in use by BMW since 1968, delivers you smoothness first and foremost. You barely really know it's there, and that's the hallmark of a good 6-cylinder engine, that it just whistles away in front of you and takes you where you need to go with minimal fuss whatsoever. So it's not the most powerful engine in the world, but it having been around for so long and BMW having continuously refined it for all of that time means that it's a lovely, lovely old engine to use. Simple as well, overhead camshaft, etc. You know, no multi-valves, no electronic throttles, nothing like that. It just means that it's simple, it's easy to repair, and also very, very reliable at that. But the fact of the matter is that this is quite an old car now. It's 35 years old, but it still feels so modern in so many ways. You still have refinement, you have brilliant ride comfort, I must say, and your quietness. You just have, when it kicks down, that M30 straight 6 coming to life in front of you, and it feels and it looks so classic as well. I am thoroughly enjoying this car. But that suspension that I spoke of being below us is simple McPherson struts at the front and semi-trailing arms at the back. It does mean that you can get a little bit of camber change if you do something stupid, maybe in the wet, but it means that it's very nimble, it's very agile, and it means that you can feel the car beneath you in a way that with you know, a more modern and multi-link system, for example, it feels too competent to really feel what's going on beneath you. But again, like the engine, that makes it so simple and easy to maintain. There are just fewer moving parts, but the results aren't so different to a more modern car. And so I'm driving this now thinking that I could very easily take it to the south of France. Maybe it might need a little bit of petrol in it, but yeah, I'm sat here. I also have my trip computer, so I can even see all the, you know, my fuel economy, for example. I can see my range, all that kind of stuff that you can in a modern car. You still do it here. And this car was designed in the late 80s. And of course, I have a blow pumped cassette deck, which makes me very happy indeed, so I can listen to my tapes, which of course I still make, because because I'm me. But it's such a classic car, this. Just has all the hallmarks of classic BMW styling into Klaus Luther, back when they really were something to be proud of. And cars have not moved on in the last 35 years anywhere near as much as you think they've done. Cars were competent for a long, long time. We just have a few more creature comforts nowadays and a bit more technology. That's all we really have. And in other ways, we've lost out, because a lot of BMWs now don't have 6-cylinder engines. They don't have the classicness that this car really has. And so, in a way, this is also a dying breed. Not only is it a great classic car to daily, but it's also something that won't be around forever. And so, if you like what you see today, and you would like to have a little look at this car, head over to our website, have a look at the photographs of it, read the description, learn a little bit about its history, and maybe even book an appointment, come and have a look at it for yourself. I really thoroughly like this car. It is such a gem. The E34 platform is a wonderful, wonderful thing. In many ways, you could call it the last of the real classic BMWs. So if you enjoyed this video, please do click like and subscribe as well. We've grown this channel an awful lot in the past year, so it really, really helps and allows us to do more videos like this for you all to enjoy and to show off some of the amazing cars that we are fortunate enough to have in.